The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
Well, welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. I am your host, Jill. This is episode 97, Theriocide, on Broken, the Suspicious Deaths of Alydar and the End of Horse Racing's Golden Age by Fred M. Kray, Part 5. I met Fred back at CrimeCon in 2023 in Orlando, and we talk about that a little bit, actually, but we got into a discussion on this book. It's very different from the normal true crime books that I brought to you because the victim here is a horse. But there also may have been some other unintended victims. It's a complicated story, and Fred does a masterful job of laying out what he discovered in an effort to find out what happened to Alydar in November of 1990. And now I'd like to introduce you to Fred M. Kray. Hey, Fred. Thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate you giving me some time today.
Yeah. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate it. How was Crime 2024?
It was awesome. It was really great. First, seeing people that you connected with the previous years and reconnecting and seeing what's gone on in the last year. We both had great spots last year.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I'm going to be stuck in the back far corner someplace. No, I was the second booth in. I had Crime Online directly across from me.
Yeah.
I had prime real estate. I came home with nothing.
Yeah, that's great.
A lot of people were down and out fans. So we're going in the right direction.
It's social media and podcasting is a lot of effort, and sometimes it pays off and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, if it grows, great. If not, I'm retired. I'm having a blast.
Right. And being retired is a challenge, a very big challenge.
Well, you have to find something that is meaningful.
That's right.
Right? You know, I have to have something, to stimulate my brain. And fortunately, I've always loved true crime.
Right.
Someone said to me, you're Cliff's Notes on crack. And I said, yes, yes, especially from CrimeCon. They come home with all the books. And then a lot of people, I said to them, and did you read them? And they're like, no. Really. And I said, here I am.
To me, retirement was the biggest challenge of my life.
Was it really?
Yeah. Because you can just say, well, I don't really need to do anything. And you can just doom scroll, and, you can get depressed because you're not doing anything. And I've always been busy and intense. And the book was, that was a 5-year odyssey there. And that certainly took all my time. So,
oh yes,
it's good to have a project, and it's good to, be busy.
I want to know Tommy Burns' story.
Yeah. He's a character, and he's, did you watch the Netflix with him? Yeah. I mean, that's him. And he has had a crazy life. And, it wasn't in the, I don't know if I put in the book or not. I don't remember, because it's been, but when I asked him about his father figure, Barney Ward, he was still as emotional about it at that moment as he was when it happened. And I thought, wow, this is a deep wound for you. And if he had not gotten into drugs and drinking and all this other stuff, he could have been something.
Oh yeah. There's a mind. This is going to sound odd. There's almost a decency in there.
I agree with you. That's what I felt.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. I was prepared to hate him. And when I went, I thought, how can I like this guy? But I'm not the only one. The FBI agent who was his handler picked him up at jail when he got out of jail, and likes him too. He seems remorseful. He seems direct and frank. And I'm sure you've felt this yourself when you're talking to people like that, who, were former criminals, that they give you, he gives you an insight into, or a gateway into this behavior that you'd never be able to see without it.
Yeah, that's exactly what I try to do. What's this guy thinking? I mean, I know it's just your opinion,
right.
But JT Lundy, listen, I want to talk about the horse and everything,
right.
But JT Lundy, when he takes over at some point, JT Lundy, he sets out in high school that he wants to take over Calumet.
Mm-hmm.
21 years old, marries 16-year-old Cindy. Which seemed to have borne him no love of Lucille for certain.
Well, he was antagonistic towards Lucille. As I remember, he urinated on her grave after she died.
Yes.
So, I mean, if you just take that one moment and say, how did he feel about her? I think that says it all.
But wouldn't you ingratiate yourself? She didn't like him. I get that. And he buys his own farm and he's trying to win her over.
But he's not trying to win her over. When he got banned from Calumet was when she said, well, JT, you're never going to be anything. You're a son of a tenant farmer. What's the point of having that farm? And he said, well, with Lucille, guys, we'll have lots of money. So that's an insult.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, basically, he's so sure of himself when he marries Cindy that he's writing letters to Melvin Cinnamon saying, when she dies, you better get off the property. It's a very antagonistic relationship. And I think basically he's the son of a tenant farmer who wants to prove that he can do whatever he wants in this blue blood sport of kings at one of the most famous farms in Lexington. And that's what John Ward said. He said, that was his thing. He was going to spend more, do all the things he wanted to do. It had nothing to do with class. It had to do with him dominating something that really people were nice to him because of the power he had at Calumet. You wouldn't want to insult the guy who's going to grant you breeding rights to Alydar. So
right.
people were polite to him, but there were many people that almost without exception, everyone said that he was not qualified to run Calumet Farm.
Well, he proved that.
And he proved that. His defense was, well, this is what the heirs wanted. They wanted to bring Calumet back to the dominance they had in the 50s and 60s. And this was one way to do it, was spend all this money. But he made some incredibly bad decisions. I mean, he spent on Secreto and Magambo millions and millions of dollars, and they never produced anything. They created no income for the farm, and it was all on Alydar to carry the farm.
Yeah. I wanted to know I know he wanted to, bring the farm back, and he winds up running it into the ground and destroying it.
Yep.
But he's also flying around on the airplanes and, buying and leasing planes and living this lavish life.
Yep.
He had to have had some clue that eventually $100 million runs out.
I think if you look at the financials of Calumet, what you see is when he first gets in there, there's a lot of money. Alydar was euthanized in 90. So even in 88, his lawyer and the accountants are saying, they're living deal to deal. They're saying, okay, we got to come up with $5 million. And they create some kind of horse deal to generate that income. And so I think their idea is at the end was we need to get enough money to sell the farm to the Japanese. That was their idea at the end. And I don't think we'll ever know whether the Japanese were really interested in a farm that was owed, all this money. But one of the things that the CFO said was, well, maybe Lundy felt that if half the debt were taken care of, they'd be more likely to sell it. And that may have been part of the reason. But it just felt to me like they were, in the last 2 years before Alydar died, that they were just going from deal to deal and getting by the skin of their teeth. And they just, because they were successful doing that so much, that they just figured it would keep going until they sold it.
And they ran out of time.
Yeah.
Because he takes over you said Lucille dies in 82.
Yeah.
And he makes it through, say, 90, 91. He's out in 91.
Yeah. When Lucille died, the farm was in the black. And when Calumet declared bankruptcy, they were $120 million in debt. So it's a lot of money.
Didn't he also fleece the right fund and right enterprises?
That. But what happened? Yeah, what he did was he would borrow money, and they had all these bank loans. And when it got to the point, in 1990, he got the heirs to sign personal guarantees on the loans, which means, if there's no money in the farm, then whatever their assets are, all those are pledged towards this debt. And so everybody that had anything to do with Calumet lost everything. And that includes Lundy. It includes Matthews. It includes Fox. Fox was one of the guys who was at the funeral. All these people, it just seemed like a curse, like King Tut's curse, that if you were involved in this, you would lose everything.
Well, I think it might be because he wasn't a very good manager and didn't know that much about money to begin with. That defense of I'm uneducated kind of can ring true there, but that doesn't excuse you not hiring competent people, too. He takes over. Everybody gets fired?
Yeah. Basically, what he did was he hired everybody who would keep quiet, that he could control. And that enabled him to do all these things. One of the things that people ask is, how could Bramlage and Dixon and McVeigh declare this an accident and pay, $46.5 million? Lloyd's paid it in 30 days, and then McVeigh's company paid $5 90 days later. Context of what they went in as was, here was a farm that had 2 Triple Crown winners and 8 Kentucky Derby winners. Alydar was covering 100 mares and making $200,000 per cover. There was no motive. If you take all that and you come into this case with a broken leg, first thought is, nobody would kill a horse that's making that much money.
Yeah.
You're familiar with the, if you think it's an accident, that's what you're going to find. So Bramlage comes in and, he doesn't really do an investigation. Basically, he comes in and says to Lundy what happened. Lundy says he kicks the door. Bramlage then figures, well, how could this have happened as an accident? If you look at his report that he sends to Lloyd's, he doesn't even talk about how the accident happened. He just says, I was called in. I found the broken leg. We did surgery. He didn't do well afterwards and we had to euthanize him. And that's it.
Yeah.
What complicates everything is the trials. Because all that stuff, if you look at Tom Dixon's report, not only does he say he didn't get his hoof caught, Dixon's opinion is he kicked the door. That's it.
Yeah.
And when I interviewed him, his answer was, well, I showed him the pictures that he took that night. I said, look at these pictures. I said, this cannon bone can withstand 7,000 pounds of pressure. How does that kick break bone? First of all, the horse is alone at 9 o'clock at night, alone in his stall. Why would he ever do that? He's not a kicker. All his grooms and all the people around him said that, except for Dr. Baker, who was in JT Lundy's pocket. There's no damage on those doors. And every horseman I talked to said it's inexplicable that there's not a dent, a scrape on either the door or the brick wall. And when I asked Tom about that, his answer was, well, I understand your point. I can't connect anything on that door to him kicking the door.
Huh.
But I went with what the vets told me. I'm not an expert. If they said that he kicked the door and did that, that's what I'm saying.
And I can understand that.
Right. And Tom's not a bad guy. I mean, he's an honest guy. So these guys are making these decisions. The one who had the most knowledge was McVeigh. McVeigh knew that the night watchman had been told to take the night off.
Yeah.
McVeigh knew that Calumet had sanitized the stall. He went in, he said, you know what? I don't think this could happen the way you're saying it happened. But remember, he only had a $5 million policy. And once Lloyd's pays their $36.5 million, I've been in cases like this where the target person pays and you have this minuscule policy compared to theirs. It's almost impossible to go into that situation and say, we're not paying, because the lion's share of the money has already been paid and it's been decided it's an accident. And so what happens is that as soon as McVeigh and his boss start to question it, lawyers get involved and they say, look, you can't talk to Tom. You can't share information. And so Golden Eagle Insurance Companies in a spot. And there really wasn't anything done to disprove it. I mean, they didn't hire they didn't take any statements except for the night watch. And Cowboy Kip and these other guys were not even discovered until the FBI went in and started taking statements. And then all of a sudden, Cowboy Kip taking the night off becomes public knowledge. And the fact that a guy drives up in the Calumet Crown Vic, gets out and says, look, we want you to take next Tuesday off. And he says, I don't want to take next Tuesday off, but he gets the vibe that we're telling you to take the night off. And he's saying, well, I've worked here all these years. You've never come to me and said, look, you look like you're burnt out. You need to take the night off. It's not right. But he does, because that he's told to do that. I've had a lot of people on my social media who are people who are experienced in horses, and they'll say a very small minority of horses can break their legs in stalls all the time. And I always say they can, but it's not likely that when the guy is told to take the night off on the very night he gets hurt, and then the next day they don't let the insurance company in until it's fixed, that Calumet wasn't involved, at least in covering it up.
Yes.
And, I tried to talk to Lundy, and he died in last December. So there'll be no deathbed confession from him. But when I interviewed his sister, she said, and this is the biggest admission, that she had talked to JT and said, you ought to write a book. And he said, well, I don't want to write a book because I don't want my kids and my wife to think I did something bad. And so to me, what's puzzling about JT Lundy is people think he did it. I mean, before I started this book, everybody was going, why are you writing this book? We already know he did it, and we already know either he did it or he paid somebody to do it. And I said, well, first of all, I really wanted to hear from the people who really knew, because if you went to the trial and you looked at all the witnesses, there wasn't really, a lot of discussion about what kind of horse Alydar was. And what was there was a narrative by the prosecution that left a lot to be desired. I mean, they didn't have an expert. You can't go into a trial and claim it was intentional if you don't have a vet or somebody to say, well, this is how it was done. So they go in and they don't have that. And the defense has Larry Blamage, who is going to say it was an accident. And so what flabbergasted me was when I interviewed John Ward, who took over Calumet after Lundy quit. And we're sitting there talking, and he's saying, I went down to the stall and looked at it. It's very boring, that part of it, with all the hardware that was there and all, on the stall and the door stops and all that stuff. But he said, you know what? I think that they backed him over to the side. They pulled his right rear hind leg and they pinned it between the stall door and where it closes, and they held it there. And I thought, if the prosecution had asked him this, they had that, but they didn't ask him. And I think that speaks to, first of all, the case wasn't really about whether it was an accident or not. It was about whether the night watchman, Alton Stone, lied to the grand jury. And it was, to me, that was a slam dunk case. But the whole reason they indicted Alton Stone was because they believed Lundy did it. And they thought Alton Stone would turn state's evidence and testify that's what happened. The unfortunate thing for Alton Stone is he didn't know anything.
He didn't.
Once that became obvious, here you're the prosecutor and your deal isn't going to work out. You can't just say, okay, we're going to drop the case. That you would lose face, you would lose credibility. So they have to go on with the case. And so they rightly concentrated on the issue of him lying to the grand jury. But if you read the transcripts, they're also saying that it's intentional and that Lundy knew and he, all these other things. But the defense really gave him all they could take. The defense lawyer knew horses. He had his own horses. He established from Dr. Baker and Dr. Bramlage that, the horse was a kicker when they really didn't know. These guys saw the horse on one occasion and they really were not in a position, but Baker went all out to make the point that this was intentional and that he had another horse that this exact same thing happened to. It was a misleading narrative. Mm-hmm. Alton Stone was convicted. But when you read that trial, you think, what, this entanglement theory where he gets his hoof caught between the stall door and the wall, it makes it seem in the trial like that was the theory all along, when in fact, that really wasn't the theory.
That was the kick theory. He kicked it.
And even that theory, some people testified at trial. I never heard anything about that. But Tom Dixon, in his report, the only thing that Lloyd's had to pay this claim were Tom Dixon's reports. He didn't call them, they were in London. He sent these reports, and, in his defense, they're the ones that decided whether to pay the claim. He didn't say, man, this is a valid claim, pay it. He said nothing. He just said, look, he kicked the door. That's what Brangledge says. But in his report, he says there's no evidence that he got himself caught in between there or not. And I just think he kicked the stall door at the wrong place at the wrong time.
If you've got 3 veterinarians, one a renowned equestrian surgeon, orthopedist, who's telling you this, I don't know why he would question it. I can let Tom off the hook.
Right.
But the whole thing was framed from the beginning. In psychology, there's this thing when it kind of sets you to view something. And from the moment JT Lundy said, hey, he kicked the door, it was a terrible accident, he looks all upset. It's an accident.
Right. There's no motive. There's, he's the goose that's laying the golden egg. And why would you do that? And it's not until 2 years after Alydar's death that Bill Knack and Lester Munson put a story about Tommy Burns in Sports Illustrated. In a side article, they go, the question is questions about Alydar. And they go through and they say, you know what? Now, 2 years later, we have the bankruptcy records. We have, all the information about Calumet's finance. And Ward told me, hey, when I took over, the only 2 bills that had been paid were the electric and the water. That's it. And they needed a bridge loan from the insurance company to pay payroll. And they had not paid the premiums on the horses. And Lundy's sister, Kathy Lundy Jones, had paid some of the premiums out of their own pocket on the horses. Now, here's something that the math that people don't really realize, and that is, first of all, Calumet had not paid their insurance premium on Alydar and the rest of the horses.
Yes, exactly.
And yet they paid the claim. I mean, if you didn't pay your car insurance and had an accident the next day, they wouldn't go, oh, well, we'll subtract, what you should have paid in your premium from the payout. That would never happen. But this is the way it's done with these horse premiums. And so, that was shocking to me. But here's the thing. The insurance on those horses at Calumet the premiums were $3 million a year. So after 10 years, that's $30 million that Lloyd's of London has been paid.
Oh boy.
And so for them to pay the $46.5 million, they're only out $16.5.
Right.
They're thinking, look, we're not thinking about just this incident. We want everybody to know when you pay these premiums, we're going to pay. And so they're looking, let's assume they don't know Calumet is going to go under. And they're thinking, hey, we're going to get 10 more years of $3 million premiums. We're going to get this paid off anyway.
Oh, I did not know that.
So there's a lot of mathematics there. And of course, Terry McVeigh says they really don't know what they're paying until a couple of years later when they do the accounting. And there was pressure on adjusters to get these cases paid. And Terry McVeigh recounts a claim where, they said, look, we don't like that report. You need a different report so we can pay this claim. There's a lot of factors to it, but, once that Sports Illustrated article comes out, they also talked to some vets and said, you know what? We don't think that the horse breaks his leg kicking a stall door like this. And the truth is, afterwards, everybody agrees to that. Up to the point, there was a story by Carol Flake that was done before the Sports Illustrated article, where Bramlage starts to enlarge on this idea that he says he kicked through the stall door. And so from the time after the accident all the way up till when Carol Flake's article comes out, then this entanglement theory starts to develop. And it really, after the Sports Illustrated story comes out, then Steve Haskin interviews him for an article in the newspaper. And now the whole entanglement theory is what really is the theory. And the big hole in that theory, in this whole evolution of this entanglement theory, is that when Dr. Baker, who is the co-surgeon with Dr. Bramlage, he's there that night before Dr. Bramlage. He's there with Dr. Bramlage, and they both do the surgery together. When he testifies before the grand jury, before the trial of Alton Stone, he says nothing about the entanglement theory. He tells the grand jury the horse kicked the stall door. That's it. He goes on to say, Baker, to the grand jury, I had a horse kick the stall door in this way and break his cannon bone. And so now he goes to trial, Baker, Now he says, well, no, it's the entanglement theory. That's what happened. And so the prosecutor says, well, wait a minute. When you were in front of the grand jury, you said nothing about this. And he tries to explain it away by saying, well, I didn't have the x-rays then, and now I do. But it's clear there's a foul up there.
He clearly didn't get the memo.
Right. And so when I interviewed Dr. Bramlage, this was one of the points. I said to him, look, if everybody knew the entanglement theory, how do you explain that Dr. Baker didn't say anything about it to the grand jury? And Bramlage says, well, maybe he didn't believe the theory. And I thought, well, if it's that much of a theory, then we could have any explanation.
And you've mentioned this, that here you have Doc Baker, who is not the esteemed best equestrian surgeon in the country, not agreeing with Dr. Bramlage's theory.
Well, it's not so much he doesn't agree with it. He doesn't say that, they didn't cross-examine Baker about it in front of the grand jury. He just gave his opinion and left out the entanglement theory. Point is if indeed the entanglement theory had been running through the entire case, how is it that Baker didn't know it? Very short time later, now he does know it, and he's sure about it. So, I think that whole thing speaks to the problem with trials and how they don't necessarily, and I'm sure you've heard this before, that the narratives are built by the lawyers for their cases. I don't think the Alton Stone case solved anything about what happened to Alydar's leg in this incident. And what's interesting is that what happened after that was after the verdict, after Stone is found to be guilty, then J.T. Lundy and Matthews go on trial for bank fraud. This is completely apart from the lying to the grand jury. And in that case, now the prosecutors learned their lesson and said, you know what? We need an expert. So they get George Pratt. And George Pratt authors a report, which all these documents you can see on my website. And basically he says there's no way that Alydar could have exerted enough force on this door to break his leg, because the cannon bone takes 7,000 pounds and he'd have to kick it 3 feet above. The problem is that it comes to light that the bolts are rusted out and that they really are not holding the door. And that's the whole thing he bases his opinion on, is that assuming that those 2 bolts are whatever diameter they are and that they're solid bolts and Alydar kicks them, then the force of those bolts holding that door down, would require so much force to get the door open enough to get his foot out. And he couldn't generate that much force. For some reason, the prosecutor never asked him a hypothetical assuming that. So they present his testimony and he says, you know what? There's no way that Alydar could have kicked hard enough to do this, to break his leg. But what they don't ask him is to assume that those bolts are not a factor. And so that can only mean one thing to me as a lawyer. They knew the answer and it wasn't good. So if they asked him, well, what if the were bolts? Well, then it could have happened. The defense was afraid to ask it because I don't think they knew the answer.
Probably right.
Could have said, what if this happens? And the guy said, well, it would have been the same thing. They don't want to do that. And the judge interrupts in this very part of the testimony when he says, what would the force have been? But the judge is not really supposed to be examining like this. They're supposed to just call balls and strikes. So all they get from the cross-examination and the judge is, well, if the bolts were rusted, it would have been less force. But they never quantify it in any way. None of this comes out in the bank fraud trial of J.T. Lundy. They get to this part. When they do the sentencing, they want to enhance his sentence, J.T. Lundy's sentence, by saying he killed Alydar. So from a legal standpoint, there was a lot of criticism about this because basically you're trying to sentence Lundy for something that you never charged him with and that was never proven in the actual trial. And many lawyers talked about the fact that this was unfair. But apparently there was case law that said that the prosecutor could do it. And remember, the judge is the only person that's going to hear all the evidence. So if he thinks it's not any good, he's not going to do anything to the sentence. So basically what he says was, look, I don't know what this sentencing hearing is going to show. And they only had like 3 hours to put on this whole case. To me, I've been rushed in cases and it's not great. The judge is on you about hurry up. We've already heard this. And he's really pushing you to finish your case. And when you look at the transcript, what you see is really sort of a conversation. There's not really a lot of cross-examination, and the witnesses are for the prosecution. The FBI agent basically gets up and tells all the investigation that happened in the Alton Stone trial about the horse. And then they put on George Pratt. And for the defense, it's Larry Bramlage again and Tom Dixon again. So Tom Dixon tells the story of all that, and then Bramlage comes on and says, this is what happened. And so it really was a half-hearted attempt because the prosecutor, they didn't have enough time. And that, it felt rushed, and I felt like when they were cross-examining Dixon, it wasn't like, isn't this true? It was like, well, do you remember this? And isn't this what happened? And it was really kind of a conversation. And so that part of it was not real exacting. And at the end of the case, the judge said, well, I don't think you've proved by a preponderance of the evidence that he had anything to do with it. So I'm not going to enhance his sentence. The prosecutors believe that he did anyway, because he did get, a much longer sentence than Matthews did. I think the judge looked at the evidence in the fraud trial, and there was ample evidence to show bank fraud in Lundy's creating $1 million tax deductions for Chiak, giving him free breeding rights to the horses, and, getting Lundy to take out a loan for the Cocoa Art. I mean, they took 5 things, and it was clear from those 5 things. And I don't think the I didn't know what we were doing defense went well for in terms of the judge. And the judge actually commented on the sentencing, and Lundy's lawyer said, well, he was just a sucker, and, he didn't know what was going on. And the judge said, look, he was as guilty as sin. And while I did have a problem with Matthews, who was just making an hourly rate, trying to represent his client, this was not that. So he gave him, I think 4 years.
Yeah.
So it was an interesting sentencing thing. I've never seen it done before where they try to do this kind of thing, but I'm not a criminal lawyer, so I wouldn't. In the end, I thought that it was a shame that they could not have done a better job and prosecuted something that was related to Alydar. But by the time they brought the criminal charges, Alydar died in 90. The statute of limitations has run on everything except bank fraud. So the timeline is that, Alydar dies in 1990. The next year, Calumet declares bankruptcy. The bank, First City National Bank of Houston, gets taken over by the government. The FDIC comes in. Prosecutors go in and start looking at all these bank loans, and they see Alydar as this collateral. They're going, well, who is Alydar? How do these loans go so bad? As they get into it, they see bank fraud.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so Chiak is their inside man. And they basically, Calumet has to keep him there in order to keep their loans being approved.
Yeah, keep him happy.
Yeah. And one of the things that's not in the book, because I did it like a month ago, is I actually interviewed Frank Chiak's bodyguard.
Oh, boy.
So when I was interviewing people, I tried to follow all the leads. I didn't really think the bodyguard was a lead, but, we're getting to the end of the publicity for the book. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to try to find this guy. Couldn't find him. So I hired a private investigator in Texas. And, within 5 minutes, he said, here he is. This is his phone number. And then I thought, well, will he talk to me? The guy picks up the phone, and it was like Tommy Burns, and he talks. Now, he doesn't know anything. He says, look, I was his bodyguard. But the reason I talked to him was because John Veach, who was Alydar's trainer, said to me when I interviewed him, he said, man, you ought to talk to the bodyguard. That guy was scary. He was around, and we all were like, man, if anybody could have done something, it would have been him. And he was, the guy was a believable guy. I mean, he was convicted along with Frank Chiak and went to jail.
Mm-hmm.
Because Chiak had basically been convicted twice of bank fraud. And this guy who was his bodyguard got convicted also because he got involved in a conspiracy. But, I talked to him for about an hour. He's a very interesting guy. He said, look, Chiak had big money. I was a guy who, he didn't frisk people, but he would come in and he would talk to the guys and eye them up. He said, the only time I saw Lundy was when they came to Houston to talk about their bank loan. But I made it a point, and it all makes sense, to not overhear anything, to not be within range of conversations. Because if something happens, I don't want to know anything. This guy had been in Vietnam. You could tell he had that military sort of attitude, but he was an interesting guy, but it was a dead end.
I was hoping. Sometimes you forget about the maid who hears the conversations between the husband and wife. I'm like, ooh, the bodyguard. And no, unfortunately.
I followed up on a lot of guys. I had people call me when the book came out and say, I know stuff, but the stuff wasn't probative of, it was stuff we already knew. I had a guy who was a business partner with Lundy, and he got, after this happened, and he lost all his money. So he was a disgruntled investor with Lundy. And of course, what would you think would happen? This is a guy who stiffed $120 million worth of creditors. So, and even after this, he got involved with the sale of a horse with his son, and there was a suit over that against his son. And it was the same kind of, we didn't really own the horse and we couldn't pass title. Lundy tried to get a pardon from Clinton.
Yes.
And so even at his sentencing, it was typical Lundy. So, he's going to get sentenced, and the judge says, stand up, and Lundy stands up. And the judge asks him, have you read the sentencing report? And he says, no, I haven't read it. And now all of a sudden, here's the judge that's in charge of how many years you're going to get. And you're telling him that you haven't read the sentencing report. And his lawyer immediately jumps in, to prevent disaster from happening, and says, no, we've gone over it, and blah, blah, blah. And he says, do you have anything to say? And Lundy says, no, I just want you to do what you think is right. And, then he gets sentenced. But even there, you think, you can't get out of your own way.
Huh.
And, the interesting thing is that people still believed in him. So, for example, his wife, one of the things in the fraud trial was that when they signed one of the notes for the loan, that his wife, I think she owned part of the property or whatever, he forged her signature on it. Mm-hmm. And so before the grand jury, his wife, ex-wife, and they hadn't been married for years, decades at this point, had told the grand jury, I never authorized him to sign my name on that document. But when she gets to court, she changed. She says, no, yes, I did. And so now the prosecution is saying, well, that's not what you said before the grand jury. So you wonder why? Why are you still supporting him? His sister, who paid money out of her own pocket for the insurance premiums at Calumet in 1990, I interviewed her, and she said, look, if he hadn't given me the initial job of doing all the insurance for Calumet, it was kind of he ran Calumet with a lot of family members. His son was a bloodstock agent. She was the insurance agent. And, he's keeping the money in the family. She still loved him and supported him. And then at his funeral, two guys that were pallbearers, which was shocking to me, were Peter Brandt and A.J. Foyt. Now, those two guys, Peter Brandt was a creditor of the bankruptcy estate. And Peter Brandt was involved in this thing where right before Alydar died, Calumet owed him for some money, I think from Magambo or Secreto, and they had to pay like a $700,000 payment. And they didn't do it. So they decided they would pay a part of it. So Lundy sent, I might not have the figures exactly right, but so let's say the check was supposed to be for $700,000. And I guess Brandt negotiated saying, look, just pay me 70. Okay. So somehow the check gets written for $700,000 and gets sent to Brandt. And Brandt immediately realizes that this is the wrong amount and takes the difference between whatever it is that they had agreed on and puts it in his personal account. And for 10 years, Calumet and Brandt fight over who's paying for the mistake. Brandt and Lundy are saying, well, you should never have cashed that check to the bank. You need to eat that because you should have never cashed that check. But the interesting thing is that when Lundy's secretary, who wrote the check out, is asked in trial over this, what were you told to write the check out for? She's very evasive. She doesn't really say whether it's 70 or 700. So he's a pallbearer. And then A.J. Foyt is a pallbearer. Now, A.J. Foyt also was owed money because Calumet had advertised on A.J. Foyt's cars, Calumet Farms. There was a story that after they declared bankruptcy that A.J. Foyt was mad because he had to take all the embroidered stitching out of the racing suits those guys wear.
Right.
Because Calumet hadn't paid their bills. But, I understand it because actually I think J.T. Lundy gave A.J. Foyt a horse who was named Foyt, and he was a pretty good horse. So, it's just interesting how all this stuff goes around, and in the end, you're left with these different threads of people who are still in your corner, even after this, terrible cascade of events that leaves Calumet destitute and bankruptcy.
He must have had a personality to him, because some of these people who dance, on that line of legal versus illegal, they have that sixth sense about people who they can trust and who will be loyal. He must have had something.
I think what it boils down to, and I'm kind of reminded of Anne Hagedorn's book, A Wild Ride, is he took the people around him on a wild ride. They would go to Paris for breakfast. They would go to Australia, look at horses. They had two private jets. They had, this beautiful farm. And he had the keys to Alydar. And so everything is private. You cannot get to him unless you go through Susan McGee, and she's protective of him. And all the people who are in the club of Calumet, it's a secret club. And they keep everything there. And I tried to talk to all these people, and none of them would talk.
Yeah.
And, when I went to Lundy's house and talked to him, I just think he was a very brash guy who wanted to prove himself and surrounded himself with people of like who wanted to make money and wanted to be in his club. Everybody around him liked being with the rebel that he was.
Well, everyone likes a bad boy.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of Lana Del Rey's song where she says, "I heard you like the bad boys too, honey." Is that true? I thought,
Fred, tell me about Alydar. We talk for another hour and a half.
Yeah, we could. Well,
it's about Alydar.
It is. And, it's funny because some of my fellow writers have said, this book is really at the bottom, a love story between you and Alydar. And it is. Yeah. And it's strange because there's no way to really explain it in a way that people can understand except to just say what happened, which is, in 1978, I had just gotten my first job as a trial lawyer, and I was overwhelmed. I mean, my personality is not suited to that job. So, I'm kind of an anxious worrywart. If you're a lawyer, that's a great trait to have because you'll stay up all night. You'll do things out of fear that other guys just fall asleep and say, I'm not going to worry about that. So it makes you a great trial lawyer, but it doesn't make for a good life. I knew this instinctively in 1978 that I was not suited to this job, but I also knew that I was good at it. And I was really thinking about quitting. And you think about times in your life where there's a fork in the road. This was one of them. I could have quit and done something else. It wasn't my life's goal to become a trial lawyer. It was like, okay, I graduated from college. I don't want to sell IBM copiers. That's not something that's challenging enough for me. So I'll go to law school. Hey, Perry Mason's pretty cool. He solves all his cases in an hour. He always gets perfect cross-examination and wins every time. Who wouldn't want that job?
Right.
So that's kind of the only thing in my mind. And so I graduated in Nebraska. I went to Miami. I knew nobody. I could not get a job. I saw an ad in the newspaper said, trial lawyer wanted, no experience necessary. I said, yes, this is me. I went. The guy hired me on the spot for $10,000 a year and basically said to me, you know what? You should be paying me because you don't know anything. And I'm going to have to teach you. You're going to be a stone around my neck until you get to the point where you can try a case. And by the way, today's Friday and Monday's a trial. Here's the file. Go for it. Now, you don't know anything. You don't know the parts of a trial. You don't know. And I'm telling you, he might have sat down and talked to me for half an hour and that was it. Now, my weekend that was the end of it. I mean, I have never been I was never so frightened as when I had to go into that courthouse. And there was a part of me that wanted to run away. And if I hadn't been brought up the way I had, I would have run away. In that setting in 1978, I decided, I'm going to go to the races because I had worked at the racetrack in law school and I love to watch horses run. I mean, I'm not going to say that in horse racing's current state, I'm for horse racing because there's a lot of problems with horse racing. It's not like it was in the 70s.
Huh, no.
But in any case, I love to watch them run, and so I go to the track. I see this horse Alydar there, and I know nothing about these horses. In Nebraska, the horses, they say that they plowed the fields in the morning and raced at night. There's not thoroughbred racing like this. And so I'm watching this horse come around the turn and he's, next to the last place, whatever. And he puts his head down and his ears back and he comes storming back from behind, to win the race. And I felt like, wow, that is determination. And I was really impressed, and he was beautiful. And I said, you know what? I'm going to come see him when he races the next time, which was at Gulfstream. And he does the same thing. And so for me, there was this sort of, I don't want to say it was a lesson, but it was like to me, look, you can achieve this. You need to stick with it. You may be behind right now, but look at what this horse did. Look at this graceful beauty and this determination. And you can't really describe it in words. And so I stuck with it. I went back and I said, okay, I'm sticking with this. And so forever in my mind, I owed him for taking this fork in my life. And so, I watched him in a Triple Crown. I rooted for him. And, I really then, the job overtook me. And after that, I didn't really follow his breeding and all that stuff. So I retired from being a lawyer and I went into animal law. I did that for, 10 or 15 years. And then I decided, okay, I'm really tired of court, no matter what the stakes. Even for whatever it is, I'm going to do something else. So I got back into looking at horse racing, and I lived at this point in Gainesville, which is right next to Ocala. It's 30 minutes away. And one of the horses that struck my fancy was Dr. Fager, who was probably one of the fastest horses to ever run. And his headstone was in Ocala. And I thought, you know what? It's hard to find it on the internet. So I said, I'm going to take a horse tour and I'll ask the people there where it is. They'll know. So while I'm on this horse tour, they're taking you to all the farms in Ocala. They didn't take me to where Dr. Fager was. So the lady is saying to me, well, why are you on this tour? What's your interest in? What's your favorite horse? And I said, Alydar is my favorite horse. And she says to me, well, the lady driving the other van was at Calumet when Alydar got hurt. And I said, oh, wow, I'd like to talk to her. So she says, okay. And I get over there and this lady is not wanting to talk to me. You can just see that I can see in her mind, why did you tell this man that I don't want to talk about it? So I said, well, listen, I had known enough about it to know the rough details of it. And I said, well, what do you think happened that night? Because at this point, we have the accident theory and we have, Dr. Bramlage's theory and we have, the Sports Illustrated thing.
Right.
I did not know about the trials at that time. And she said, well, everybody knows what happened. Everybody who worked on that Calumet knows what happened that night. And I said, well, do you think JT Lundy did it? And she said, he aligned it. Those were her exact words. And I said, well, what, you were there? And she said, yeah. I said, well, what happened? And she said, I'm not going to tell you anything. I'm not going to talk about this anymore. And now this is 30 years after this fact. Now I'm thinking, what? Why? So I said, what are you afraid of? She said, I'm afraid for my life and my children's life. And I had heard, that there were questions about whether the mafia was involved in Calumet. And I thought, this is what she's talking about. But she turned and left, and that was the end of it. And we all pretended like the conversation never happened on the rest of the tour. But that's where it started. I thought, you know what? How can it be 30 years later and you're that afraid? And it wasn't faked. It wasn't like, I don't want to talk to you. I'm going to make this up. This was a lady who really thought this. So I did all the research. I found out that, there was mafia ties to Calumet because JT Lundy sent horses to Ocala to a guy who had bought a farm with drug money.
Oh, boy.
And he kind of bragged about it in the rebel kind of way. And to scare you, he'd say, yeah, I got this connection with, this guy, John, who's in the Gotti family down in Ocala. And, Horseman, that was another thing. Horseman went, you know what? You kind of wondered, do you want to get on the wrong side of that? But in my research, that didn't pan out. I mean, I don't think the mafia was involved in this. I think that it was a sexy sort of topic in Wild Ride that spiced up the book, but I think that's true. But still, when I researched it and I found out there were trial transcripts, I said, okay, if they're trial transcripts, we're going to hear what really happened. And so I flew to Houston and got them and went over them. And then what really opened my eyes was talking to Tom Dixon. I said, will you meet with, he wouldn't give me anything. You know how guys are who've been burned by the press, and he's been burned by the press. He's that guy who said this was an accident. And he said, you know what? I asked him, do you wish you'd never taken this case? Would you wish, because you're in the supermarket and there's that guy. And he really got trashed by the prosecution. They really didn't treat him right in cross-examination. They raised a lot of things that made it seem like he was, involved in something he wasn't. and that he'd said things he didn't say, and they were really not true, but the prosecution sort of raised that specter, and he was mad about it. He's still mad about it. And so he didn't want to talk to me. And I said, listen, let's meet. So I finally, after I gained his trust, he gave me the photos, and I looked at them. And that really made me wonder more than anything. As a lawyer, you look at what's the physical evidence of anything.
Yeah, you have to.
And I look at it and I'm thinking, how could there not be like wood in his hoof? How could there not be scrape marks? How could there be nothing? Absolutely nothing. And that's really, I'm stuck with that. I'm still stuck with that.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I don't care if the bolts were rusted or not. If Alydar has to push that 300-pound stall door out 6 inches, 3 feet above the bottom to get his hoof outside of that and not leave a mark, I just think it's unbelievable. And so does everybody else except Dr. Bramlage, Dr. Baker, and the people who are in that group. I wasn't able to go to Calumet when I was writing the book. And in February, I was.
Oh.
And you will be the first person to hear this. But today, after all these years, I was able to get onto Calumet and see all the things I'd written about, which I wish I could have done. But it was a very emotional moment to get onto the farm and to tour. I got to see the stallion barn, the breeding shed, the canteen. But when you go to the barn and you look and you go into the stall where he was and you look at it, it's huge. I mean, there was a horse named Hightail in there, and he was all the way to the left. And 6 more of them could have fit next to him. People are saying, well, there's no way that you could have gone in there and backed him up. There was totally enough room to do it. There was totally enough room to swing a crowbar in there if you wanted to. And the way it's set up, there's kind of a blind spot where there's a wall there. And Alydar, when he's backed out on where the stall door opens, he can't see anything to his right. It's all blind until he gets his head out. And so when you look at the stall hardware, and the same door is on there. The same door that Tom Dixon took pictures of is still on there. And it's more beat up, but you look at it and you go, you know what? If I put all my might, and even the guy who was there with me, I'm not saying who was with me or how I got on, all the horsemen say no, Tom Dixon and the veterinarian say yes. So I think that there's all this other circumstantial evidence that, that you have to take into account when you look at it. The other things that weren't in the book, Cowboy Kip, who's the guy who was told to take the night off. Mm-hmm. People say, well, how come you didn't identify the guy who told him that? The FBI tried to do that. They took pictures of everybody they could think of. They weren't working in Calumet's office, but that they came to visit. The problem is there were so many people like that. And so they couldn't take everybody's picture. And I found out through my own investigation that the 3 people that were at the gravesite were there the night that Alydar was hurt. Now, nobody ever said that. So you have Robert Fox, Alan Crutchfield, and John Secura. So you read Wild Ride, and she says all 3 of those people were at the grave. Well, Alydar was only injured the day before. Those guys all live in other places. There's no way that they could be told Alydar has a broken leg and he's being euthanized that very morning and get from where they live to Calumet in time for the burial. Robert Fox passed away. John Secura passed away in this crazy accident where he got locked in his car and burned to death. So there's a lot of weird things. But so I talked to Alan Crutchfield. He finally admitted, yeah, we were all there the day Alydar was injured. Why were you there? I can't remember. Did you go to the funeral? Yes. Then he talks about holding Alydar's ear as he's lowered into his grave. I asked all the horse people that I knew, what is up with that? Who does that? And they said, we have no explanation. And for the first time from anybody, Alan Crutchfield says, look, he was there on the premises and Alydar got cast in his stall, which means he fell down and he couldn't get up and he got, in a corner. And nobody has ever brought that up, as a realistic explanation. Yet he's there when it happened. He's on the premises. Lundy must have told him something. And he just goes on this rant about, people are out hunting Lundy and I'm not going to say anything more about this. It's just crazy.
Yeah, it is. It is the coincidence.
Yeah, there's no way that all this can be a coincidence. There's like 10 different things that you look at. And Crutchfield testified in the bank fraud case. And he was testifying about this tax deduction that Frank Chiak took. And he was one of the guys that wrote a check for like $400,000, but he didn't remember. Now, he was trying to keep out of being prosecuted. So the prosecutor says, hey, here's a $400,000 check. Mr. Crutchkoff, is that your signature? Yes. Did you sign this check? I don't remember, but that's my signature. Do you know whether you had enough money in the bank for this check to be negotiated? I don't know. Everything was, I don't know. And I mean, obviously what he was trying to do was keep himself out of the conspiracy with Chiak and Lundy of creating the check kiting scheme that allowed Chiak to take this $1 million tax deduction. So it's a crazy world, the horse world.
It is. It is.
Going back to the Calumet, I got on there, I saw everything, and I went to where Alydar was buried, and I wrote an epilogue about my visit. And for those who bought the ebook, I went on my ebook. It's already there. They've already uploaded that. It will be in the print books, but after, I mean, you won't be able to get the print book again. So what I've done is I've said, okay, if you bought the print book, you can go to my website, click on epilogue, and you can read the epilogue, download it. And I'm also offering fans a signed epilogue for free if they want one. And then you can put your email address in there and your mailing address, and I'll sign, print it out, copy it, and mail it to you.
I think it's remarkable.
So it's a very, I haven't put it on my social media yet. I'm trying to make sure that all the submission things work and all that stuff, but I'm sure it'll be done by the time this comes out.
Yeah.
But I'm proud of the epilogue because to me, it gives an ending that I always wanted to write, but I couldn't because I wasn't allowed on the property.
I'm really glad you got a chance to go.
Yeah, it was great. And the circumstances are really funny, but I don't want to get anybody in trouble because I don't know if anybody knows I was there or not. So whatever.
Yeah, it is what it is. And especially that you're making copies available to.
Yeah. It's not right that you bought the print and now you can't get it. So I think it'd be cool to have. I mean, you can get a signed copy, put it in your copy of the book, and I think that'd be cooler than having the book.
Yeah. 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 I like that part.
Yeah.
Oh, listen, thank you so much for doing this.
No problem.
I love stories of the genesis of these things and how it worked and impacted your life. And this, I hate to say love affair with Alydar, but I share that.
That was part of what I loved about it was I got to talk to the trainer before he died. An interesting story about the trainer. So John Veach has passed away and John Ward passed away. I interviewed both of them. So John Veach loved Alydar more than anyone. He wanted that horse to win more for Alydar himself than he wanted him to win. And they had this love affair. People that saw the two together said, you know what? We can tell that those two love each other. I actually sent him a copy of the manuscript, not the final product, but like the next to the last thing, because I wanted him to have the opportunity to tell me, look, you got this wrong, because if you read the book, it's a really behind the scenes look. There's a contrast between what John Veach would say before a race about Alydar and what he really thought. And the racing part of it is really cool because it's not written for a racing fan, but there's all these behind the scenes stories about how Alydar, for example, got hit with a cloud of dirt in the Kentucky Derby and nobody knew about it. And they were worried he wouldn't be able to race in the next race. Anyway, I sent it to him. I'm out at dinner and he calls me on the phone and he says, man, I love your manuscript. It was so great. I said, well, John, that's great. I'd love to have you give me some kind of praise quote for the book. And so he starts talking about how, he's going to give it to all his friends for Christmas. And it's the best thing he's ever read. I said, well, John, I don't really feel comfortable going home and writing what you just told me. Can you write it for me? And he said, I'm not a writing kind of guy. I said, well, look, my wife was there and she said, well, have him call you back and then we'll record what he says. And then you can just take it from the recording. So we do that. And 2 days later, he passes away. And like on the one hand, I'm saying how awful that he passed away. And on the other hand, I'm thinking how great it was for him to learn all the stuff we found out about what happened. And, I interviewed him before he called me on the phone. And then I talked to another guy named Ed Bowen, who was friends with John. And apparently they had lunch once a month. And, I sent him the manuscript and he's a very famous horse racing guy. And he said, well, I had heard from John that it was the best book he'd ever read. And so, he gave me a praise quote too. That story was kind of like, to me, so serendipitous. And I was so happy that he got to read all that because of all the people I interviewed, he loved him the most. that was his big star horse for his life. And I also got to talk to Alton Stone after I wrote the book. He didn't really add much to the story either, but I could see talking to him how he would get in trouble with when he was being asked questions. Because one of the things I wanted to ask him about was, did Alydar have his halter on the night of the incident? Because he had it on when they came that night. And if the practice was to take the halter off at night and put it on in the morning, then that would mean somebody would have had to have come to put it on him to break his leg.
Right.
And he goes, well, I don't really remember if he had it on or not. And then like a couple minutes later, he said, well, you know what? Maybe he did have it on. And I could just see a prosecutor asking him, well, did this happen? And then he's that kind of guy. He kind of thinks out loud and he kind of, gets insecure about what it is that he said. And he doesn't want to, say something wrong. So he then says something different. If you're prosecuting somebody about it, this becomes a real problem. And that's what happened to him. And I asked the FBI guy who investigated the case, did they ever find that he got any money or any value? And he said, no. And I said, so it's possible sitting here today, which is, 2017, that he didn't really know anything. He said, yeah.
I came to that conclusion.
And did time in a case where I talked to some of the jurors and they said, if we had had something about his character, maybe we would have found him not guilty. But none of the people who could be character witnesses could afford to travel to his trial in Houston from Kentucky. And he had to get a loan to go to his own trial. So it's a very sad story, Alton Stone's story.
I feel like he was another victim in this whole thing.
Definitely was.
I really do. I think he couldn't get out of his own way.
Yeah. And he's not, he's a college dropout who's not real sophisticated, and he works with his hands, and he's been work construction his whole life. There were legal questions at the time about whether he should even be prosecuted, because almost nobody gets prosecuted for lying to the grand jury. It's like perjury. How many cases have you actually heard that went to trial?
Well,
Very
he wasn't
few.
the target. They wanted him to...
He was a tool that turned out to be not useful.
Wrong tool, wrong trial, unfortunately for him. And he got caught up in the whole thing.
Yeah.
I understand, but unfortunately, he really got the short end of the stick, that poor man.
He did. It's part of the regular criminal process. And, he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And for us, we just say that, but he lived it.
Yeah, he really did.
And when I tried to talk to him, he didn't want to talk. I said, well, I want people to hear your side of the story. He said, I done told my story and nobody listened. It was a nightmare for me and I'm done with it. And the only way I got him to talk to me was I actually took a copy of the manuscript out to his house and said, listen, I'm writing a book that exonerates you. That says you didn't know anything. I'm going to give you this manuscript. And I'm going to call you later and maybe we can meet and talk. And that's how I got to talk to him. I mean, if I were him, I'd be a bitter guy.
You listened.
Yeah.
You listened to his side of the story.
Yeah.
You really did. They just thought he knew more than he knew because he happened to have agreed to work that one night.
They also had this guy, Keith Hiley, who came out of nowhere.
Yes.
There's a whole story about going out to his house and trying.
Was that the one where there's no GPS and you're in the middle of nowhere? Yes.
Yeah. And it's where the guy is, you go on his Facebook page and it says, guns, knives, don't tread on me. And I actually hired a private investigator. And I said, listen, I don't feel comfortable going out there without having somebody with me as a bodyguard. So I want you to bring a gun. And he says, okay. And we get out there and I go, did you bring your gun? And he goes, no.
There you go. Oh, holy mackerel. Listen, Fred, thank you so much. I feel very fortunate that our booths were kind of close to each other in 2023 at CrimeCon.
Yeah.
And I'm thrilled to be able to feature your book and provide all this insight.
I need a tip from you for my next book. At CrimeCon, everybody wanted to know about animal law, what it is and how it happens and all that. And I actually had a SWAT team raid when I was an animal lawyer to recover a stolen Great Dane. And it's a great story. I'm not going to tell it to you now because maybe I'll write my next book about that. But so I'm thinking about that. I'm trying to write an outline. I've always been an animal lover way before Alydar. Got a lot of dogs off death row when I was an animal lawyer. And, those stories I don't know, maybe they'll be popular. It's hard to say.
I had no idea there was animal law. I think it is marvelous.
And that's what everybody said. So
I had no idea there was such a thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think
you
that's
have dogs
great.
on death row. You have pit bulls being banished from their town because they look like a pit bull, because some fire chief thinks that. And you get involved in the DNA of the dogs and whether dogs can be identified by their, how they look. And we had court cases about that. We had court cases about who gets the dog when you break up. Court cases about
that I believe.
Right. Court cases about who gets all the money when you die. These are all animal law cases.
Yeah, I believe it. So, I think you should. I think you should write a book. So Murder Bookies, if you're interested in following this story up, let me know.
Yeah. So
my email.
Yeah. So thank you for your time. And I appreciate our time together. And maybe we'll meet again in my next incarnation.
You never know. And thank you. I really do appreciate it. It's been terrific.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Good luck.
All right. Bye-bye, Fred. Well, I found that very illuminating. There's a lot of inside stories there. I love it when the authors get into things that didn't make it into the book for whatever reason. And I'm thankful that Fred has devoted this time, effort, blood, sweat, tears to uncovering the truth of what happened to Alydar. Fred writes that one reason he wrote the book was to reach out to the public. And he said some people did contact him after the book was published. But I always think that someone knows something. I mean, he uncovered a tremendous amount of information, but there's probably still someone out there that can solve horse racing's oldest cold case. Now, Fred also has a podcast that accompanies his book, and I think you'd benefit from it as well, because I certainly did. But I'll tell you now, it's www.brokenthepodcast.com. Please check out his brand new epilogue. I did read it between talking to Fred and now, and I was in tears again. I know I'm a wuss when it comes to this story. I loved Alydar too, but please read Fred's book. And if you already have, please check out the new epilogue. It's poetic, as Fred is living this dream of a lifetime in his tribute to this beloved racehorse. Now, our next book, Murder Bookies, in CrimeCon 2024 in Nashville, I met Lindsay Wade, and she is now retired after 21 years, where she was at the Tacoma Police Department. This is a woman who is relentless in her pursuit of justice for victims. Now, unlike many of the books we've done, her book isn't about a single case, but instead reflecting back on her law enforcement career. Plus, we get into her unique perspective as a biracial female detective in a male-dominated profession. And I found this part of the story to be really compelling. Thank you for listening, Murder Bookies. Let me know what you think. How was Alydar injured? Was it an accident or was it murder? I look forward to your emails at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com. I see you as you hear me. Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music, The Pewter Elephant by Blue Dot Sessions.